Hi there folks, looks like there's a few people in the room. Welcome back to the next Xone live Q&A session. You can ask questions in the comments of whichever channel you're watching us through, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Xone filter series, the Xone voltage controlled filter. Got little toys here on the go. I've got a little setup. Using a 9.6 today. At the moment I've got a noise source coming in on one channel which I'm monitoring, filters here so I can show you what's going on, a little bit of music, and a few little things that I've got to talk about, hopefully some questions you guys might have that I can answer. So if I switch between these two for a minute. The Xone filters. Everybody who's used a Xone mixer knows what a Xone filter is. Everybody who hasn't used a Xone mixer and used a different mixer might not really understand why we make such a big deal out of them, or why people using Xone mixers might prefer ours to any of the others. So that's some of the stuff I was going to talk about. If you've got questions about how they work, if you've got one, if you've got questions about why they work in a certain way, or why they don't work in a certain way, if you think they should work a different way, pop them into the chat and I will fire answers to you. So hopefully you can hear me. I've got my man backstage going to shout at me if you can't, and at the moment I'm assuming all's good. So let's just start with some basics for you if you don't know what it is. The Xone voltage controlled filter. If I show you back again on the mixer, on the 9.6, it's this little section here: filter switch, freak sweep, response select buttons, resonance control. On the 96 is a crunch feature. If you've got a 92, that one will be your LFO control. On the 9.6, two filters, one either side of the main mix channels. Same on the 92, and on all of our other DJ mixers with the exception of the DB series, there's one filter. PX5 has the filter over here. On this side, if you go back to 43C has a filter over this side and assignable from push buttons. 23 has a lighter version of the filter in the middle there, and I'll talk about the differences shortly. If you go back to some of the older products, you would see 62, for example, one filter over here, and you have two frequency controls either side of the crossfader. They still both work on just the one filter, and that's why in the blurb I've said, how many filters does a DJ mixer need? Most cases I'd suggest you need one, and one is good. Why do we have two? It's more fun. It's a lot more fun. Obviously it's a different product. It's higher up the price point. It's the way a lot of the club DJs and the higher end DJs like to work, and it gives you the opportunity and the ability to mix one track into another just using some filters, and that's a really nice creative way of working with tracks. If beat matching isn't the way you want to mix, or if scratching isn't the way you want to mix, it also kind of adds to your sonic arsenal in terms of the effects and kind of quite what you can do to one track or another. Obviously the familiar thing that everybody might be used to, if I bring a little bit of audio up just to give you some idea that there is some audio here, is the typical sweep through the filters. I think you can hear that. Let's have a look, see if you can. You will do if I turn up the right meters. You got some audio there. doing. So just to give you a little idea, that's the kind of sound that you might all be familiar with. I am not in the mix mindset, so please excuse me if that's not rocking the party, but another day we'll do something like that perhaps. What I really wanted to do, because I know a lot of you might be watching without speakers connected, or with maybe speakers that don't focus on the low end in the way that the filters work really well with, is to kind of show you how they work. So one of the things that I've got here is a little live session, and I'm using live rather than any more scientific equipment, because it's an app that a lot of Xone users use. A lot of you guys are already mixing with it or using it for VST effects and stuff like that, and there's a spectrum analyzer in the embedded plugins of the app, so it's quite a useful way to have a look at what's going on with the audio signals. Or in this case, if I turn this up, what I've got going on here is some noise. So what you can see, and hopefully you can see my mouse as well, is signal across the audio spectrum. On the left hand side there, that's the low end, going all the way across to your mid-range, 1k up there, 10k up there, well, up to 20k. So in musical terms, show you that again, it's going to look slightly different, but I can still demonstrate it with some dynamic signal. So that's a music track. You can see it's dynamic. There's a lot of low end content in there. Some mid-range jumping up and down, and that's your tops, hi-hats and bits and pieces. So this is giving me a way that I can describe and show without you necessarily having to listen to what's happening. And I think for the purposes of this exercise, I think it's quite a good way of talking about some stuff without getting too lost in genres of music or mixing one way or another. We're not here to teach you how to DJ. We're here to talk about our hardware and why it works the way it does, how it works the way it does, and things that you can do with it to hopefully improve and enhance the ways you mix with whatever music you use. So I'll go back to here. This is the noise going through the system, and if I just show you, I'll switch to my other view, which I think gives you the ability to see what I'm doing with the controls whilst I'm talking, and without me drowning it out with music. So at the moment I've got a low pass filter curve selected, and my freak set all the way clockwise up to the high end. I've got the res set to the center position, and I've got no crunch dialed into this filter. In that context, and some people will ask us questions in support about why the filter works a certain way, or when I turn the filter in I hear some changes and stuff. Again, I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute, but as an overview, when you switch the filter in, you should expect some difference. It's a filter. What it does is it takes out signal content from the audio path. In this context, the whole audio spectrum. So the reason I've got it set up like this at the minute, and what people ask is, can they turn the filter on without the filter affecting the audio? So as I said, it's sort of a bit of a question that doesn't quite make sense, apart from in the context of the mix, where you want to have the filter in, you want to be using the filter in a minute. Well, there might be a track that you want to bring some filter in on, but when you start with the sort of settings, you kind of don't really want it to be affecting the audio, certainly not too dramatically. And in this position, it's as close as you're going to get to a flat filter with the filter on and engaged on a channel. So again, if I show you with a low pass filter setting, the freq turned all the way up to 20k and the resonance set to the center position, the filter stage, although it's engaged and turned on, so it is affecting anything that's happening in the mix bus, it's not really impacting on the signal. As soon as I start to turn this anti-clockwise with a low pass filter, it lets everything below the cutoff point pass through the filter to the mix bus. You'll see what happens on the graph up here is it will start to take this content out. If I turn it there you go. So I turn that anti-clockwise, you can see now I'm cutting out frequencies above 1k. If I go all the way down, we're losing the mid-range there, down into where the low end is, low mids, bass. If I go all the way down, pretty much all you've got down there is the bass and kind of sub-bass frequencies really at that stage. You'll notice that there's still signal that you can see on this spectrum analyzer, but that's fine. If you see where that is in terms of signal levels, it's way down, kind of minus 90 dB. If you have a look here and on the meters, this is what I'm metering. It is the output as well here, so you can see that. Hopefully as I turn that up, you will see there the levels on that meter starting to come back, and the levels on the main meters as well. So there is signal content there. It doesn't cut it right out to zero. The louder your system output is and the lower frequency speakers can handle, the more audible that might be, but that's relative. In this context, that's getting towards cutting all the frequencies out, and up here that's in the realms of not affecting anything. If I turn it the other way around and switch the high pass filter in, again high pass filter, everything above the cutoff frequency is passed through the filter and to the mix output. You'll see it, just some tops getting through there. You're up into the territory of some of the stuff that I might not be able to hear. Younger listeners and people who haven't wrecked their hearing will certainly be able to hear some tops, very high frequency sort of territory we're into. If I sweep it down, you'll see the same thing. Most of the frequency content in the spectrum is there. The reason that you can see, if you notice I turn the filter on and off, hopefully you can notice just right down here in the low end some change when I switch the filter in, switch the filter out. That's because there's a little bit more energy in the low frequency content, and as I said, the filter is being switched in and the filter is designed to do something. So you should expect the filter to have an effect when you turn it in to one of the channels. It's what it's designed for. So it's not a problem as long as you kind of understand, appreciate the whys and wherefores of what it's doing and why it's doing it. But if you do want a flat filter with the filter on, again, just to reiterate that, I'd have the low pass filter engaged, wound all the way up, and the resonance set to the center position. The reason for setting the resonance to the center position is something I think I can show you with I'm going to show you with the user guide here. If you have a look at all of our filters, all of our mixers, you will see in the user guides a description of what the filters do. And if you look on the bottom right of the 96 user guide VCF reference section, it shows you the response of the filter's output at some different settings of the resonance, the res control, with it at its max, with it at the center position there, and with it at min. And so at minimum it is actually attenuating a little bit of that cutoff frequency. I'll talk to you about that in slightly more technical detail, and try not to go too off track as I'm talking as well. Bear with me pushing the buttons and stuff like that at the same time, trying to give you a point of reference as well as describing what's happening. But I'll show you as well, I think. It I hope will help to illustrate the point. So at center position, I am not affecting the resonance or the Q of the filter. Q relates to the damping that's applied on the signal that's going through the filter. So at the center position, it's not being damped. The Q is fairly flat. If I turn it all the way up to wild, it will start to increase the Q, lower the damping, so that what happens is the response cutoff frequency will start to resonate or oscillate a little bit more. And that's if you've got the wild turned all the way up and you start sweeping it around, you'll hear, certainly when you're listening to it, and hopefully as well on this graph, you can notice a little peak there. If you see there, that is the cutoff point, the roll off, some people might refer to it to. If I move that around, again with my low pass filter engaged, that's where you get kind of what the legend looks like there. If you have a look at the legend on the mixers, you'll see this characteristic ramp up here with a little bump, and then it flattens off again. If I turn the resonance down, you should notice that little peak, put it a little bit higher up somewhere so it becomes a little bit more pronounced, and it will do with frequency, and or depending on what speakers or monitors you're listening to on, it's a little bit easier to hear some of the mid-range frequencies than it is the lower end, unless you've got some nice bass bins, in which case you'll feel it as well as hear it. But if I lower the resonance, you can see there down to about the midway position, that's adding, can add upwards of 6 dB onto the signal if you turn the res right up. It will be dependent on what's going into the filter, so what track you're playing, what the content of that track is, if it's a really bass heavy track, if there's a lot going on in the mids or the tops. That will be, that level, that amplitude that the wild outputs will change a little bit as well. But between wild and center, you can see that flattening, and if I turn it from center down to mild, you can see it attenuating. So to give you a little bit more context for some of the people who've asked us questions about why that works the way it does, or what they hear when they're using a filter, the Xone 23C, for example, just has a high pass and a low pass option on the filter, and a mild and a wild setting. So you don't have the equivalent of a flat resonance option with low pass or high pass. It's going to be mild or it's going to be wild. So you've got the freak that you can sweep. You switch the resonance in or out, and you're swapping between the high pass and the low pass. So in context of a can I turn the filter on and have it flat, not affect the audio, with the 23C, the answer's leaning more towards no. But in that context, I would still suggest that if you turn it mild, and again have the low pass option selected and turned all the way up, as you can see on the graph there, it's fairly close, and I'm trying to approximate with the 96 here what happens on a 23. So you've only got these two. You don't have this control. You have a switch and don't have the crunch. Filter on or off. Where's the freak? And you're either mild or wild. Now if you have it set to wild, you will definitely see and hear that peak, because our filters are deliberately very resonant when they're set wild, and it's that resonance that kind of makes one of the signatures of our VCFs, one of the things that we like and most of the users like as well. So 23C users, if you want to have a flat filter, turn the filter out of the circuit, turn it off. But if you've got it in and you kind of want it to not be affecting your audio too much, switch the mild switch in, turn the frequency all the way clockwise, have your low pass filter, and if I turn this one on and off, you can see there's a little bit of change there right at the top end, but in terms of how that would affect audio, so I'll bring some audio back in on the meters here so you can watch it with music. The energy in the top end is less anyway, so what you'll notice isn't so pronounced. What you hear won't be so audible. And as well, you've got the music moving around, you've got the hi-hats dancing about, you've got transients and harmonics coming in from other instruments and stuff like that. So you can perhaps time it where you drop it in or out, and that's going to be largely unnoticeable in the mix until you start bringing it back in here. That is going to sound mostly just like the bass is coming through, and I'll go into some ways of using it and whys and wherefores perhaps in a little bit more detail as we progress. I've been talking for a little while yet, don't see too many questions and a few people in the room, so by all means fire some questions away if you can. I can see your questions coming in from YouTube and our A&H Facebook, and if you're watching on the Xone Facebook, I can see your questions coming in there, so feel free guys, pop some comments in. I can see there's a few people in there. Some shouts out Sebastian, Charles de Tour, Boan Fong, anybody else who's out there, let me know you're there, let me know you're listening, it always helps. I can see you're watching, but we don't know what you want me to talk about, or whether you're just happy to listen to me talk about it until I think I've covered most of the bases. Anyway, let's get back to flat filter, if you like. Turn that out. There's some music playing on that one. Again, that's got in there. You should be able to hear that now. You're listening as well. Turn the filter on. If you've got decent speakers, you will be able to hear that low end that's in there. If I turn the resonance up, you can see the boost on the signal there, dropping up and down. Here it's fairly dramatic with the wild in. You'd be able to hear that, so I won't inflict it on you for too long. But as I say, you can start to see what the filters do. I'll take the music out for now and go back to just the full spectrum signal as a point of reference. Talk to you about what the filter is. It's a voltage controlled filter. What's the difference between that and the other mixers? What's the difference between our analog voltage controlled filter and digital filters? That's kind of really some of the things I want to talk about. We go to send and returns. Nooney, thanks. Sends and returns is something I'll cover in another session. I think I might have talked about them in a little bit of detail in one of the previous sessions. So you're welcome to go back onto our sessions page on the Alan Heath website. I think I'm 3 or 4 in now. So if you want to have a look at those. But certainly I'll make a point of that. I'm going to talk about the filters today and how the filter works. But certainly I'm happy to talk about sends and returns on another session. I will plan to be here on a monthly basis. As close to a monthly as we can. I think we might have dropped a session last month, or we've stretched the month to 6 or 7 weeks, because one of the other things is the world is coming back finally to some kind of normal. Certainly on the DJ scene, it is really getting busy this summer. All of our friends and colleagues on festival circuits are starting to ramp up, really busy. Clubs are opening again. A lot of the DJs we work with are really playing catch up on gigs and stuff. So we've gone from sort of artists with 3 or 4 nights out a week to 5 or 6 nights out a week. Some of the clubs are doing Sunday sessions. A lot of clubs are starting to do all-night sessions or more than 2 days a week. So there's a massive amount suddenly now going on, and all I can say from what we've experienced so far out in the field is it is such a joy to see people being able to use mixers out in space amongst people, turned up. I know a lot of you have spent a couple of years or more in your studios, in your bedrooms, in your kitchens, mixing on headphones and mixing on sort of fairly small speakers, probably having the neighbours banging on the door telling you to turn it down. This year and this summer, the game has got back to where it should be. So for everybody who is getting a chance to go out and about, hopefully this will help you understand how you can kind of use our filters in some creative ways as well. So Akos, I can see your question there. I want to ask about options when the high pass and band pass are on at the same time with the mild or wild res. I hear more air in the lower end. Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit as well in terms of using different options on the switching, using more than one or the other. Let me give those people who maybe not so familiar with what the filters are and why we use a VCF a little bit more of an outline as well. So the VCF is a voltage controlled filter. It's where the cutoff frequency, and that's the freq control for all of you who aren't familiar with it, what sets that cutoff frequency I spoke to you about a little bit previously, that little corner there. This is controlled by a DC voltage applied to the filter rather than a variable resistor in a standard filter, or if you're using a digital filter by an algorithm and somebody somewhere having plugged in some DSP which is crunching numbers and ones and zeros. So the difference and the advantage is it gives a constantly variable output according to the position of the pot. It gives us a more accurate response curve, or a more accurate and continuous adjustment, I should say. So in reference or relation to a standard filter where the audio is going through a variable resistor, this is a much more accurate way to adjust the frequency, that cutoff point. Comparing it to a digital filter, this is analog, so this is happening as the signal passes in real time through the components in the mix bus stage. The DC signal means that the audio isn't being passed through the resistor that's adjusting the frequency, but the adjustment is being applied to the signal. I hope you can appreciate a difference. What it equates to is qualitatively the audio that you put through the filter isn't being affected by electronic components in the same way as a standard filter does. And the same thing applying for digital. Digital will be quite dependent on the analog to digital conversion and the digital to analog conversion. Obviously, with a digital filter, it's got to be converted from the analog signal into a digital signal, filtered, and then output back to analog. So you've got processes going on there that add to the complexity of the processing rather than the effect of the filter. And ultimately what this is about, because it's a performance related feature, is being able to do it in real time as sonically cleanly as possible. And by cleanly, what I mean is without it without it changing the audio you put in ways other than the filter itself. So you're not adding any aliasing. If it's digital, you're not going to affect the quality of your WAV file or your vinyl, whatever, other than the filter that you're putting through, you know, the low pass, the high pass, cutting out the frequencies that you want to cut out. I hope that makes sense. The other thing that it does is it produces a wider operating range than most resistors on their own can do, and this is why we got the whole 20 hertz to 20k whole audio spectrum covered here. It means that the amount of effects or the ways that you can affect the signal that you put through the filter is just expanded, let's say, right across the audio spectrum. So if you want to work with the filters down in the low end here with the low pass set, if you just want to drop everything out of a track but the bass, you can kind of find a nice point here. Let me show you with another hand. If you're using down here at the low end, obviously some tracks are going to be bassier than others. Some tracks your bass is kind of up in the 100, 200 hertz territory, you know, 150, somewhere around there. More and more music is lower, heavier bass, 80 hertz and below. If you want to tune down there, you can. A lot of techno and stuff like that doesn't have necessarily that real sub-bass content dynamically, other than just rhythmically. So if you want to focus on somewhere else in the spectrum for a particular track or for a particular genre, this enables you to kind of tune into that. One way of using this quite successfully, in my opinion, is if we have the high pass filter selected there, and say if you've got speakers that aren't 12, 15, 18 inches, and or neighbours that don't like you turning them up, but when you're having a little mix, you kind of want to feel that bass a little bit more. Or you've got two tracks you're bringing together, one of the tracks bass is not quite as pronounced as another one, you can use this filter to add a little bit of weight to the bass in a track. So the way that you could do that is to turn the wild up, and again, hopefully you can see that if I'm using the noise reference here, is as I start to tune this up, if I've got a track where the bass line is higher up in the 80, 100, 120 hertz range, or even just one or two tracks, it could be 1020 dB, 1020 hertz apart from each other, so one of them sounds a little bit louder than the other, or you can't quite get that mix seated together with the two tracks. Try just dialing the freaking up to sort of between kind of 9, 10 o'clock, maybe 11 for some stuff. Soul, funk, maybe a little bit higher like that. Dub and roots, jungle is going to be much lower down. It enables you to kind of blend those tracks together a little bit more sonically using that way. I find that really useful way if I'm listening on music that's got a lower frequency content that I can't really turn up, so the music's driving so much. So practicing and stuff like that, once you've had a play with it, you can see how it will really work in the mix between two different tracks or more tracks. Again, to give you an overview of the band pass, high pass, low pass options on there, it's a state variable filter for those of you interested in the kind of technical side of stuff, and that means it gives us the capacity to provide you with 3 outputs from one filter: the high pass output, the low pass output, and the band pass output. The band pass output, if I put that one on here, cuts out frequencies above and below the cut-off point, the roll-off point, and you can see there the attenuation either side of that. peak. If I turn that to flat, again, I can demonstrate a little bit of the resonance. It's easier to see with noise a little bit higher up. And all the way up there, it's really just providing me with a high frequency, high pass. But down in the mid-range and across the spectrum, this is the one that gives you the very swooshy, classic VCF sound. Just give you a little bit of audio so you can see what I mean, perhaps. Hopefully you can hear that and it's not too offensive for you. That swooshing sound, that's a really nice way of bringing one track into another, or adding some kind of dynamics. If you start mixing with the bandpass filter on a track with another one already in there, that will start to kind of move the audience quite physically as well in clubs and stuff like that. It becomes almost, you can use it like an oscillator on top of another rhythm or something like that. So the bandpass filter there is a very dynamic way of bringing in audio on one track over another track that's already in your mix. The low pass, as I said, we can use that for cutting out everything but the bottom end. Quite nice way of starting a transition. And if you've got two tracks, two filters, quite a typical way of using it is to cut the bass out of one track as it's coming to an end and just bringing the bass on the next track. So on the filters here, you would have them set probably as I've got them, like this: high pass on one, low pass on the other. You've got your tops in on this track, bottom in on that track, and that's a very classic way of blending between the two, with the wild on one, slightly less ramped up on the other. That's the sort of very typically used way of blending between the two tracks, just using the filters. Couple of questions. Let's have a look. When you asked about using the high pass at the same time, when you use them both at the same time, what you end up with is a notch filter, and this is one of the more sort of subtle ways of using it. If I show you with a sweep here, I'll turn the wild up so that what I'm doing is I'm reducing the damping, increasing the Q on it, so it's a tighter filter and a more resonant filter. Once I start to turn this up, you can see there, hopefully, that notch. That's cutting that frequency out of the mix, out of the spectrum. See that there? What's that, around 2, 3, 4, 5K up around your vocals? It's a subtle one if you just use it on one track in a mix, but it's certainly if you're blending tracks and you're using techno, stuff like that, where there's quite a lot of content across the mid-range, and some you might find that one track clashes a little bit with another because a certain drum rhythm or one drum is slightly tuned differently to another drum on a different track. This is a really nice way of enabling you to blend those two tracks together by removing just a specific element of the audio there. On other mixers, you'll see that maybe the sculpt on Richie's Model 1, Model 1.4 as an enhanced notch capacity, but this is a really nice way of helping you blend quite similarly sonic tracks together. If if you want to make one more pronounced, one frequency and the other, it would be just the bandpass on its own with the wild turn up. That will help you bring one particular element of the track into focus. And somebody had asked on another post on Instagram, what's the point in having all three selected? And this is going to be a very subtle effect. So I think the guy said, excuse me, I can't remember your name, but if you're listening and tuned into this bit, couldn't hear any difference. That's because essentially you've got an all-pass filter with a peak at the center point. So technically speaking, there's not a great deal happening here. There is more happening than it just all being off, but it's going to be very, very subtle because you're allowing all the frequencies above a cutoff point to pass through, but you're also allowing all of the frequencies below the cutoff point to pass through. So that's kind of full spectrum. Adding the bandpass in the middle puts the resonant peak of the cutoff in the center of the spectrum, or where the freak control is. So if I move it around, you can see there, hopefully, that little peak is moving backwards and forwards across the spectrum, up and down through the range. Up in the tops there, it's a little bit more pronounced. Down at the bottom, it's not as noticeable, but you're looking at noise rather than a dynamic signal. So perhaps if I show you the dynamic wave, again, you're not going to necessarily see so much happening here because all of the other frequencies are moving around as the rhythm and the track and whatever's happening in the audio, in the music, is moving up and down in energy as well. That's potentially why you wouldn't hear much going on, but it will give you a very subtle change, almost like a whisper in some tracks. So if you're not listening at high levels, it's going to be harder to notice because it's not dramatically affecting the signal, but it certainly will change it. If you can't hear it at all, I'd probably suggest maybe go back to your gain stages and stuff like that. Make sure that you're using the good dynamic range that our mixers have so that you can hear what's going on. You'll hear more difference, but subtle, if you're letting the amplitude of the music swing across its full range, which is why we say, don't mix down here with everything else turned up. Get the levels coming into the channels operating around their nominal levels. So look, other questions. Sometime when I fix your filter on, I move the resonance, I hear a little noise or crackling sound. Same with the internal USB sound of one of it. Sometime I hear when I move the gain knobs too. Is it a fault or is it normal at a VCF? Akos, I think the only time you're hearing that is if you don't have any audio routed through the filter. Or you've possibly got a 92. And in each case, it's not a fault. I'd be surprised if it was a fault inherently. If there is a fault, you'd know about it. But if I take the audio out of this and I switch some filtering on and off, you can see there. So there's nothing routed to the mix. Clearly the output's there. There's no signal in that. That filter is quiet. That's the output that we're monitoring. If you're listening, you can see a little bit there now, right at the high end there. But if you look at the level, you're around about 100, minus 100 dB. So that's as quiet as a jet engine is loud, if you want to use some non-technical terms. Yes, you could hear it if you plug your headphones in and you turn the headphone levels all the way up. But if you've got music playing and you've got music playing at program signal levels, that is inaudible noise floor, what we call system noise floor. And that's normal in an analog system. That is perhaps a difference that you might notice if you're using digital mixers from other brands, is that when something is turned down, generally speaking, it's off. But One of the things about having some noise in there at this very low level and or inherently in the system is that is the nature of analog. There's electronics happening and there's current passing all the time. The level that it's at really isn't an issue when you're playing music, and if you can hear it, again, the chances are that you've got very low level signal input. So if I can try and show you on the meters up here, what I would suggest is it's kind of that at the inputs. Certainly look on the channel there, down around, you know, minus 15, minus 20. By the time you've done something in the mix, maybe tweaked some of the stuff here, you're still really low in the noise floor. And if you reference our ideal operating level section of the user guide, you'll see that we say bring the signal up here. One of the reasons for that is that it will mask the noise floor and any of that noise, or that you can hear. You say you can hear the crackling sounds and stuff. The crackling sounds and stuff are way down in the noise floor, and that would only really exist on a 92. Certainly the 92 is inherently quite a sonically noisy system. It's part of its charm, the harmonics that are in there, the electronics, the analog, the current flowing through the components, if you like, is what gives it its signature sound and its sonic signature. And it's a classic. It's one of the reasons why people also add things like tubes into audio mixing. And you might be familiar with things like CDs sounding very clinical, or certain types of digital audio sounding very clinical. The human ear quite likes a little bit of noise. It's attuned to it, and there is also something sonically pleasing about it. PhDs and all sorts of stuff, you could go down many rabbit holes discussing the whys and wherefores of that, but essentially a little bit of noise in the right place is generally a good thing. Valve stages would not fetch the prices they do and be the sought after items they are were it not for that fact. And one of the things I can show you as well, perhaps talking about harmonics and noise, the 9.6 I experienced about 1.5 years after I bought the mixer. Of course, I think if you're concerned that you've got some problems, we'd be happy to talk to you about that in a support ticket. We can review kind of particular way you've got anything set up, and hopefully advise you whether or not there is a genuine issue, and if there is a genuine issue, it's certainly something that could be fixed. So submit a ticket if you've got any particular questions about hardware or concerns about your hardware. You can contact us at support@allen-heath.com. That will open a ticket. It will be with myself or Luke. If it's a Xone product, we might ask you some more questions about how you have stuff set up, just to check that you're kind of using the mixer the best way that it can be used. And then if it transpires that there is an issue, certainly it's one that we would advise to get serviced, because we use these mixers all the time. This one that I'm using here today is generally on my desktop 5 days a week, and both myself and Luke have Xone mixers at home and that we use out, and so do the rest of the Xone team who are developing them. So we are really confident these days in the quality of the products and how they're designed to work, and how that manifests in practice. So by all means, if you're concerned about something, submit a support ticket to us. We'll answer you and we'll help you get anything that's wrong fixed. To go back to the kind of overviews and stuff to kind of talk about, and I was going to talk to you a little bit about the harmonics, is showing you how the crunch works. And I'm going to change to some little bit of stuff I prepared earlier. This is showing how crunch affects the filter stage. And if you've read the manual or you've listened to any of the other sort of tutorials or some of the feature descriptions, perhaps from other places doing reviews or quick start guides and stuff like that, the crunch control, this little one up here above the res on the 96, adds controlled harmonic distortion. The harmonic distortion, what's harmonic distortion? If you have a look at these lines here, that is harmonic distortion being added in to a sine tone. So this is the fundamental tone being fed into the filter. At this one, it's 160 Hertz sine wave. You can imagine what that sounds like. I'm not pitch perfect, but it's a boop. I don't know where that was on a spectrum if anybody's analysing it, but it's just a constant tone. Dialing in some crunch adds these second, third order harmonics into the signal path. And if any of you are watching on the A&H channel and tune into any of Keith's Q&As, you'll know that he's done a description of the SQ's tube stage plugin. And essentially what that does is the similar thing. It adds harmonic distortion into the mix. Harmonic distortion can also be described as noise, and one of the things that adding this sort of noise in to a mix does is make it sound a little bit fatter, could add a little bit of grit. It changes the dynamics of the audio in such a way that the ear, generally speaking, finds it pleasing. Certainly if you're using digital audio sources, CDs, for those of you who don't use CDs, stuff that's been downloaded, FLACs or MP3s, often very sonically pure music, but can be a little bit, dare I say it, soulless. Using non-technical terms in this context, excuse me, it can be a little bit, sound a little bit pejorative, but I'm trying to offer you kind of qualitative descriptions of what's happening here rather than intrinsically technical answers. So adding in these sonic distortion, it will fatten a track, it will add a little bit of grit to a track. You can, if you turn the crunch all the way up, get some really very distorted, you know, very, very crunchy, like walking on gravel kind of effects added to the mix. And again, it's a creative tool, it's a subjective thing. So some people really, really go for the crunchy, distorted sounds. You get effects that you can pay, you know, significant sums for, which add just that in bucket loads. So using it subtly, I'll just go through moving this up the spectrum as the fundamental tone here, 180 Hertz. We're still low mids, I'd probably be calling that, still low end, perhaps not low mids quite. You're into mid-range territories here, and you can see with the crunch in there, it also changes the way that harmonic distortion is added into the signal path. So these are quite prominent signals going in. As you move up, you get a little bit more distortion creeping into the top end. Right up here, obviously there's a sine wave, so there's nothing below that. And the crunch also happens at the cutoff point. So I've done these at either where the EQ is on the channel or at some sort of 9, 12, 3 o'clock type positions of the frequency control. So you can sort of see for reference. It changes a little bit there, so down at 180 you get some quite nice harmonic distortion going on there when you're using the crunch control. Lower down, as you can see there, you're not really adding any crunch to the top end. It's going to be adding harmonic distortion at the low end, and one of the things that happens there, if you use crunch at the low end, is it will very subtly modulate the signal, or quite more dramatically, depending on how you're using the filter settings and stuff like that. You can find some really interesting effects for the bass on tracks if you've got heavy bass content and you add some crunch and some resonance. is it will sort of slightly and modulate the signal. You'll get a little bit of cancellation coming in and out, almost, I wouldn't say phasey, it's not that dramatic. It's possibly a bit more of a flange, but if you're putting it through heavy bass speakers, it becomes quite a physical effect, and it's the sort of thing that will, you know, kind of make you move. Again, difficult to describe it when at the low end it becomes much more of a feeling. But again, hopefully this is a bit of an illustration of what's happening, and it might encourage you to experiment with the filters a little bit more. Experiment is the way of finding out how things work, and what you like about them best, and I would encourage it at every opportunity. Maybe not mid-set, but again, you know, once you get used to these things, they'll become familiar ways of, oh yeah, if I set, you know, as I say, one of the ones that I'll go to quite frequently if I'm using music will be to have high pass in, freak round at the low end, and wild, and I'll dial that in between some tracks, or, you know, you can start to just get a little bit of groove, a movement into a track that just helps it rock a little bit. What else am I going to talk about? I've been talking for quite a while. It's not too many questions, so I might round it up fairly soon and talk to you again in a month. Possibly looks like it might be another sends and returns session, which is fine for me because I've got some new effects, and maybe get some audio happening as well. But what else do I want to talk to you about the filters? Foibles was one of the things we mentioned in the blurb beforehand, and that would be probably most commonly referenced to a 92, and people talk about pops and clicks, so I don't mind talking a little bit about pops and clicks before we sign off today. The 92 is a generation ago it was designed, and the technology that went into that was certainly cutting edge of its day, and has maintained a reputation as an industry standard for a generation. So we're really proud of that mixer and the way it sounds. So many people use it. You know, it speaks for itself in many respects, but we do appreciate a lot of people talk about the pops and clicks, and it just maybe gives me an opportunity here to discuss why it shouldn't necessarily be considered a problem. I think if you went to the user guide for the 92, and again sort of take you back in time a little bit, or perhaps a long way, how and where it was being used when it was first conceived was a different time and place, and to some extent some different ways of using mixers, and it would have been described at the time as a kind of preset options. The popping and the clicking tend to occur when you engage or disengage the filter on off button, or up here if you were switching a track, if I go back to my dynamic track, in or out of the filter. So on a 92, toggling between filter 1 or filter 2, or off and on, if you've got the filter on when you do that, or in certain states if you've got the channel assigned to a filter and you turn the filter on and off like this, you can notice some sonic artifacts. We call them artifacts because we don't really consider it to be a problem. I think initially it was conceived that you probably have a channel down, you would assign that channel to a filter, you would turn the filter on, then you'd bring that track into the mix, rather than what we're aware of now. And like I say, we're not sort of trying to defend too much, and we're not telling anybody that they're doing anything wrong, but we do appreciate the fact that people assign the filters, switch between the filters on and off, those states whilst they've got music routed through it. So if you've got a 92, to get to that, back to that point, if the filter's down, if the track is down, you assign to the filter, you turn that filter on or off, those clicks or pops will be way down in the noise floor. You won't hear them because there'll be another track happening, the music's happening in that. Any of those little clicks or pops should be well masked, and certainly not impacting in kind of the music that you're actually mixing or that you're listening to. Where there are examples that you can hear those clicks or pops, what you can do in some of the systems is to kind of induce a more audible effect, and in those contexts you're kind of sort of looking for it, and it's generally speaking it's not how you would use a mixer in practice. If I set this filter so that I'm loading the bottom end of the audio spectrum sonically, down would tend to be down here. Let me see if I do it on the other filter, on this one here that I've got set a different way. If I let me do it on this one. I'll turn that music off a bit though. Sorry, the signal source off. If on a 92 I set the frequency very, very low, and I either have my high pass cutoff at that low point, or all I let through is that very low end content, and then I persist in turning on or off the switch, I'm going to load that circuit with signal energy, and after a while, or with some repeated pushing, you're going to induce signal content into the low end. That is where you might start to hear a bit of a thump going on, or if you've got low end speakers, subs, big speakers, you might see a little bit of travel on those. Again, I think historically speaking, we would have suggested that's probably not really what you're going to do with a filter if you're using it in the mix. And if you use them in the way that is going to sound better for your mixes, and in the way that they're kind of intended for practical use, you shouldn't really have issues with clicks and pops. The other issue with some of the older mixers, the 92, we're aware it exists. Some of the others, it's not as pronounced, but it might still be there, is if you switch a channel into the filter with the filters already on. And again, what you're doing there is potentially adding the signal to the filter where a transient peak in the audio is then boosted where you weren't expecting it. You're trying to avoid getting technically lost in explaining what's happening, because generally speaking the people who ask us aren't necessarily technical, and it's no disrespect to any of you who aren't. There's no reason you should be. It's a sonic thing and it's a subjective thing that we're trying to cover here. But if you think in terms of having the filter in a state which will boost a certain frequency, so if I show you, let's go back to, for example, this setup, just as for the purposes of illustration, where the filter is going to be boosting a fairly easily audible frequency up in the mid-range. That's kind of where you're used to listening, where I'm talking, compared to where there's nothing happening. There's quite a pronounced difference in what goes on. Now I'm switching between full spectrum and a band pass just to kind of try and illustrate the point here, but if you see there, nothing's happening. This is music, you can't hear anything. I switch that in, you're switching in a peak at 3.5K, for example. If that happens when a drum or any element of the music just hits its peak in the chorus, verse, rhythm, wherever that happens to be, you may find that you either end up clipping the mixer's rails, so you're adding energy to that signal at a very short space of time, but at quite high amplitude. That could cause what you would hear as a click, something like that. Again, we would describe it as an artifact. So it's not something that's inherently part of how the filter works. It's more kind of induced in the way that the filter's applied. So problematic if you use it like that. I think initially I'd be inclined to sort of kind of suggest you have a look at the way you're using it, and is that really the way that you're planning to use it? Do you actually use it like that in the mix session? If the answer to that is yes, and it's genuinely causing you problems, again, reach out to us in support and let's have a conversation about it. We're certainly aware enough of some of the ways that works and impacts on people's mixes with a lot of users, such that with the 96 we've resolved those issues. Soft switching on these here now, it's silent. As I say, I'm going to struggle to show you any signal changes or peaks with this on. If I can get some music in, see if I can turn everything out on that. Switch him over there and out there. Again, trying to show you with either dynamic music or none, it defeats the point a little bit for the purposes of illustration. That is going to switch the music on and off. It is not going to do anything other than output or what the filter's set to output. So at that point, I know that I'm going to be cutting everything else out other than that top end. When I hit that filter in, everything else is going to come back. If I turn all of that signal down, for example, I'll show you here, there's nothing on the meters. That track is out of the mix essentially, even though it is still assigned to that filter. If I turn that filter on and off, that's silent. As I say, the little bit of signal you can see way down here, that's a minus 100 dB. You can't hear that. If you can hear that, what you've done is potentially about to damage your speakers when you start playing some music, because as I say, if I throw that back into the mix, we're up there on the meters, I'm starting to hit +6 there. So say that's loud. In any well-adjusted system, that is loud, trust me. You will not hear this switching with music playing. If I set a filter off, for example, obviously I'm switching here between states of a filter on and a filter off, so you can see there is an effect because I'm switching the filter in. If I go back to what I was described earlier as the flat filter, so low pass selected, frequency at max, resonance at the center position, and then I assign this filter on and off there. Okay, that is not having any effect at all on any audible signal. What you can see right at the bottom end is what's happening in the bass line. If I show you on the noise, again with that one, if I switch that in and out, there's nothing happening there in that signal path that's audible when I switch that in. Same if I switch that on and off. Perhaps if I show you a slightly different view of that. If there were noise happening here that was being added to that signal path, you would see it on that spectrum analyzer. as I'm switching that. Same here. Okay, so we are really confident these are effectively silent switches. Again, it is an analog system, so there will always be some current passing through some component, and if you look or listen hard enough, you may well be able to hear it. I have found Mark, user error is genuinely the issue with this moan. User error is quite a pejorative term, but as I say, lack of experience or lack of experimentation is probably how I prefer to put it. I found the 96 to be a little bit flaky in the filter department, but in a different way. Hard to describe as he got rid of it. I don't really know what that means, Mark, so I can't probably answer your questions. I think I've said enough. I've not got too many questions coming in, and as you can see the numbers are dwindling, so I'm probably going to round it up now. If there's anything that you wanted me to talk about and that I didn't, or if you think you asked a question and I missed it, please let me know. Add another comment in any of the channels that you're looking in, or by all means reach out to support. If you want to send us a ticket, you can drop us an email, you can go to our website and www.alan-heath.com. You can find our links to support, or you can send an email to support@alan-heath.com. Give it a subject of Xone filters, and if you start the message "Al said this" or "I wanted Al to answer this," that will get put under my nose and I will get back to you. Ben, what type of filter is the 96, or what filter model is it based on? If you go back to the beginning of the session, you can find out it's a voltage controlled filter. It's a state variable filter. A voltage control filter differs to a standard filter because we use a DC voltage to apply changes to the cutoff point with the frequency control. The same with a mild and wild. That enables us to have a broader spectrum of control than a typical standard passive filter. So it's an active filter if you're asking for comparison between one type of filter or another, and it is certainly not a digital filter. Digital filters is how much DSP. They tend to be a little bit thin in my experience because of the way that the DSP handles the signal processing. And another difference perhaps that I didn't discuss in why I would consider and we generally consider ours to be, dare I say, better, is that quite a lot of filters on certain other brands have one filter and they only offer a low pass or a high pass option. There is no adjustable resonance, so that swooshiness that you get is either only going to be a swish up or a swoosh down, and the resonance is fixed. So you can take the bass out or you can drop the bass, and you might be able to do that on each channel, but it's one or the other. As far as I'm aware, the other mixers that you most commonly come across when you're mixing will give you high or low pass, and that will be applied to all of the channels, and a sweep for all channels, but you can only sweep the same. So you can cut out the bass on one track, but you're still only cutting out the bass. You can't select a band pass, for instance, on one track to tune in, or a notch to tune out a certain frequency on one track, whilst at the same time having a different filter and a different filter output applied to another track. I think that's a significant difference in how our mixers work, and why, generally speaking, people prefer the Xone VCF. How rare can I tap the tap button to set the LFO very slow Alexandru, that's a 92 question, I know. And I've tried it myself actually to see if I can turn the LFO off effectively. If you tap it very infrequently, the LFO on a 92, so that it's blinking probably seconds apart, it's going to almost be imperceptible in terms of how it will oscillate the filter. Sorry if that's not a particularly technical answer off the top of my head, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the LFO on the 92, if you tap it at a tempo like this, and then you apply the LFO, that will affect the amplitude of the filter, or what's passing through the filter at that tempo. So at very low, you'll get a wob, 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 wob. If you turn the freak up, excuse me if my impressions of the sound isn't quite what you're after. If you want to modulate the VCF very slowly, then press it at the tempo that you want to modulate it, and you should find then the depth of that LFO will give you the amount of modulation, the amount of effect that you can hear it being modulated by. But yeah, you can get it pretty slow. I'll have a play around after the session and give you an answer either in reply to your comment here on the YouTube channel, or I'll reference it next time in another session. But I'm happy to kind of give you a little bit more of a technical answer to that with a little bit more considered analysis. But certainly in my experience, it can be very slow, and possibly slower than most music would be anyway. So almost to the state that if you tap it slowly enough and then turned up the LFO depth, it would be kind of, you'd be sort of half timing the modulation, if that makes sense. Again, have a play with it. It won't, if you've got your gain stages all set up right so that you're not going to clip anything when you get to the extremes of the settings, you won't break it. Honestly, they're very robust circuits. That's the other good thing about the VCF. As I say, you're not pushing signal through a resistor. It's a very robust circuit to play with, and certainly experiment away. It's how I found my favourite ways to use the filter. It's how we know people kind of feel a little bit lost without it as well. And you'll find subtle ways of using it that give you ways to help blend tracks together, as well as the very dramatic ways of, you know, exciting the mix or getting the crowd on board with you with the typical swishes and stuff. I think I'm probably going to end the session now, maybe with a little bit of audio. Excuse me again if it's not a little 2-minute mix. That wasn't really part of the equation, but I'll just demonstrate a few little audible sweeps and ways of using it. So if I show you the mixer as I'm using it, and I'll put a little bit of audio back into the output here, and give you that a few little ideas just on the way out. And then as I say, ask more questions, tell us what you want us to talk about, reach out to us in support, and I'll see you again with another session sometime in June. Meanwhile, enjoy the summer as it's coming underway. I hope you are getting out and about. If you're at festivals, have a great time. It's got to be good to be getting out again this year. See you some more.